They said it was inappropriate. That's the word they used. Flat, definitive, like a judge slapping down a gavel. Inappropriate. As if grief came with a dress code. As if 47 years of marriage could be wiped away because a ceramic urn didn't match the centerpiece. I brought my husband's ashes to Thanksgiving. I placed him, gently, in the chair he used to sit in every year, beside me at the head of the table. And they recoiled, like I had set down a bag of trash. Melissa, my daughter-in-law, actually flinched. David didn't say anything at first. He just looked at her, then at the urn, then at me, like I'd farted in public, and now he was the one who had to apologize for it. Melissa pressed her napkin to her lap with both hands and whispered, That's just not appropriate, Martha. Not angry, not even upset. Just tidy and condescending, the way she talks to her children when they spill juice on the white couch. And David, my son, nodded, avoiding my eyes, as if that settled the matter, as if their discomfort was more sacred than my husband's memory. I am 81 years old. I live alone now, in a one-bedroom apartment above a hardware store with paper-thin walls and a radiator that hisses like an old cat. But I wasn't always alone. For nearly 5 decades, I shared a life with Harold, my husband, my companion, my co-pilot in all things tedious and extraordinary. He died in February, after a long illness that the doctors described with phrases like age-related complications and best to keep him comfortable. I kept him comfortable. I bathed him, fed him, changed him. I held his hand when he forgot his own name. I slept in a chair beside his hospice bed until the nurse told me he was gone. And now, 10 months later, I am told that bringing his ashes to Thanksgiving is inappropriate, that his presence, contained and silent, ruins the aesthetic. I didn't tell anyone I was bringing him. I wrapped the urn in one of his flannel shirts, the green one with the elbow patches, and placed it in a canvas tote with the cranberry chutney I made from scratch, the way Harold liked it, with orange zest and a bit of cayenne. I brought a pie, too. Pecan, not pumpkin. He never liked pumpkin, though Melissa insists that's the only traditional option. Everything with her is about optics. She sets the table like it's for a magazine shoot. White linen, gold chargers, little cards with each guest's name in calligraphy. Except mine, which just said Mom in block letters. Not even Martha. Not even a flourish. When I arrived, Melissa greeted me at the door with a smile so tight it looked like it hurt. David hovered in the background, holding a glass of wine and a phone like he couldn't decide which one was more important. The grandkids, 2 from Melissa's first marriage, 1 from their union, barely looked up from their tablets. I asked where I should put the pie. Melissa nodded toward the counter. Anywhere, really. We've got a lot going on in here. Then she returned to her mandolin, slicing fennel for a salad no one was going to eat. David kissed my cheek and said, Glad you could make it, Mom. Like I was an acquaintance doing them a favor. No mention of Harold. No question about how I was holding up. Just a quick pat on the shoulder and a half-hearted nod toward the living room. I waited until most of the guests had arrived. Harold used to sit at the end of the table, closest to the kitchen, because he liked to help serve and refill drinks. He was tall, always the one to reach the platters from the middle. That chair had been empty the year before, because he was already too ill to come, and they hadn't invited me either. Claimed it was too hard on the kids. So this year, I brought him myself. I waited for a lull in the chatter, unwrapped the urn from the flannel shirt, and set it carefully in the chair he'd always claimed. I didn't say anything dramatic. I didn't make a speech. I just set it there, and then took my seat beside him. That was all. I thought maybe someone would smile, or remember, or raise a glass in his name. Instead, Melissa's eyes widened, and she whispered that awful word. Inappropriate. She stood up, brushing invisible crumbs from her lap, and whispered something to David. He came over a minute later, red-faced, and said, "Mum, I think maybe we should put that somewhere else, just for now. It's a bit much." I looked up at him and saw none of Harold's face in his expression. Just discomfort, just the need to smooth things over. I said, "He always sat here. I thought it was fitting." David didn't answer. He just gestured vaguely toward the hallway, and when I didn't move, Melissa came over and lifted the urn herself. She placed it, gently, I'll give her that, on a side table near the front door, next to the coat rack, like a delivery someone forgot to unpack. I sat through dinner in silence. No one made a toast. No one mentioned Harold's name. The conversation was all about property taxes and the Peloton and which school district was slipping in the rankings. I chewed dry turkey and listened to the sounds of my own irrelevance. At one point, one of the grandkids, Ellie, the youngest, asked why Grandpa was in a jar. Melissa shushed her, said it wasn't polite to talk about such things during dinner. I wanted to say, "No, darling. What's impolite is forgetting he existed." But I didn't. I swallowed my bite of stuffing and folded my hands in my lap. The cranberry chutney went untouched. No one even asked what it was. After dessert, store-bought pies that tasted like cardboard, I got up, walked to the hallway, and retrieved Harold's urn. No one stopped me. I walked back into the dining room, past the guests who were already reaching for coats and leftover containers, and set him back in his seat. Then I poured myself another cup of coffee, sat down, and sipped. One by one, the guests filed out, murmuring awkward goodbyes. No one looked at Harold. No one said a word. David walked me to the door. He didn't hug me. He just said, "Next year, maybe we'll do something quieter. Maybe you'd rather stay home. I can drop off a plate." I nodded. I didn't argue. I didn't explain that I had brought Harold not for drama, not for guilt, but for presence, because I couldn't bear to sit through another celebration where he was erased. Because setting his chair was the only way I knew how to say, he mattered. He still matters. Now I'm home again. The urn is back on the mantel, beneath the photo of us on our 40th anniversary, laughing under the lilacs. The apartment smells like cedar and thyme. I heated a slice of my own pie and sat at the little kitchen table. Just 2 plates, mine and Harold's. I set his with care, folded the napkin, poured a tiny cup of cider. It wasn't about ritual. It was about remembering, about refusing to let absence turn into erasure, about reclaiming something no one had the right to deem inappropriate. Tomorrow, I'll write a letter. Not to David. Not yet. To Ellie. Just to thank you. For asking. For wondering. For seeing him. And maybe, just maybe, next year I'll host. Even if it's just me and Harold, and whoever else remembers how to set a place with love instead of convenience. The moment it became real wasn't when they moved Harold's urn. It wasn't even when Melissa used her therapist voice to explain boundaries over mashed potatoes. No, it was later, hours after the dishes were done, after the guests had gone home, and the laughter had faded into television noise. It was when I found myself in their downstairs powder room, staring at my own reflection in a gold-framed mirror shaped like a sunburst. The light above flickered slightly, casting thin shadows across my face, making me look older, sharper. I had brought Harold with me because I didn't want to feel alone on a day we always shared. And now, in that mirror, I saw what I'd become in their house, a guest from another century. A woman from a different time who didn't understand the rules anymore. That's what David had said once, half laughing, half annoyed. "Mum, the world's moved on. You've got to keep up." But I wasn't trying to keep up. I was trying to hold on to something that mattered. It should have been obvious earlier, but grief does a strange thing to time and perception. It makes everything feel slightly dreamlike, like walking through soup. I thought that if I dressed nicely, brought the right food, arrived on time, smiled at the children, they would remember I belonged. That I mattered not just as a historical figure, a set of framed stories, but as a presence. But the truth was stitched into every interaction that day. When Melissa handed me a glass of mineral water instead of wine, "Just in case you're watching your medications?" When David asked if I needed help up the steps, "The railing's a little steep for you, maybe?" When the neighbor, Susan, from 2 houses down, introduced herself and said, "So lovely to meet David's mother. I didn't realize you were still in town," as if my residency on this planet were an open question. And then Harold, my husband of nearly half a century, who built the deck in that very backyard with his own hands, who planted the maple that now shades their children's sandbox, reduced to a disruption, a decorative offence. Later that night, after everyone had gone to bed, I sat in the guest room, fully clothed, staring at the ceiling. The room smelled faintly of lavender linen spray and dust. I could hear the faint hum of the dishwasher downstairs and the occasional murmur of the baby monitor. I hadn't unpacked. I never do in their house. There's nowhere to unpack to. One small dresser, filled with spare linens and scented drawer sachets. A chair with a pillow that says "Gratitude" in cursive embroidery. And a tiny closet with exactly one empty hanger. I always feel like a placeholder, like something waiting to be stored or discarded. I set Harold's urn on the nightstand, turned toward it, and whispered, "I'm sorry, darling." I thought it would mean something. I thought they'd want to remember. The ceramic felt cool under my fingers, indifferent. Sleep didn't come. At 3 a.m, I crept quietly down the hallway, trying not to wake anyone. I passed the closed doors, David and Melissa's room, the kids' rooms, the office labelled with a brass plaque. Productivity zone. I walked past the framed prints of quotes like, "Gratitude is the attitude," and "Home is where the Wi-Fi connects," automatically. I made my way into the kitchen, where the motion sensor lights blinked on with a soft sigh. The counters were spotless. Not a single dish left in the sink, not a trace of the feast we'd supposedly shared. I sat at the island and poured myself a glass of water. The pie I'd made had been thrown out. I found the empty pie tin in the trash, crust still clinging to the edges. They didn't even offer to keep a slice. Melissa had probably decided it was too rich or too old-fashioned. Everything that didn't fit her version of the world was dismissed with those words. That was when it began to sink in. Not just the awkwardness, not just the humiliation, but the betrayal. They hadn't just found Harold's presence uncomfortable. They had found me unnecessary. My grief, my memory, my presence. I wasn't a part of the holiday anymore. I was a disruption to be managed, like a broken thermostat or a stray dog. I sat at that kitchen island with Harold's urn in front of me and realized they hadn't really meant for me to be there, not in any meaningful way. They'd invited me out of duty, out of politeness, so they could say they had. But they didn't want my stories. They didn't want the weight of who I had been in their lives. They wanted silence and neatness. They wanted a version of family that fit their decor. I left the kitchen and stepped outside onto the patio. It was cold. The night air bit through my cardigan, but I didn't care. I stood there barefoot, on the stone pavers Harold once laid with his own 2 hands when David was just a boy. I looked up at the sky, clear, sharp, full of stars, and I spoke out loud, not because I believed Harold could hear me, but because I needed someone to. "They erased you," I said, "and I let them." The words hung in the air, visible in the puff of my breath. I thought about how we used to host Thanksgiving ourselves. How Harold carved the turkey with exaggerated flair, how we always ended the night with a round of charades and too much whipped cream. I thought about the old mismatched plates we used, the ones with chips and hairline cracks, and how every year we said we'd get new ones, but never did. I thought about laughter, about mess, about being seen, and I understood, finally, what had happened. This wasn't about Harold. It wasn't even about the urn. This was about control, about performance, about a family that had reshaped itself without me. I had become like one of those inherited items no one really wants, but feels too guilty to throw away. A lace doily, a ceramic rooster, something you dust, display for holidays, and then shove back in the cabinet. But Harold wasn't a display. And neither was I. I stood there until my toes numbed. Then I turned back into the house, picked up the urn, and walked upstairs without a sound. I set him back on the nightstand, pulled the quilt over my lap, and sat with my hands folded. I wasn't angry, not yet. I was grieving still. But grief, like cold, sharpens with time. I lay back against the pillows and whispered into the dark. They don't get to define what's appropriate. Not anymore. The next morning I woke early, not because I'd slept well, but because the quiet in the house was oppressive, the kind of silence that presses against your ribs, that suggests presence without comfort. I lay there for a moment, staring at the soft light that filtered in through sheer curtains printed with faint floral vines, the kind Melissa thinks look classic. The house was still asleep. No footsteps, no creaks, just the faint mechanical breathing of appliances. I rose slowly, my joints stiff from the cold tiles of the patio the night before, and glanced at the urn. Harold remained exactly where I'd placed him, unmoved, untouched. I lifted the flannel shirt that covered him and wrapped it tighter around the ceramic, not out of necessity, but as a gesture. Tender, defiant, small. I went to the bathroom, showered, dressed in the same cardigan Melissa had once suggested was too heavy for indoors, and walked down the stairs, one step at a time, my hand firm on the rail. I passed the photo wall, Carla's children, Melissa's sister's wedding, David's office party from last year, but not a single picture of the life that made those people possible. I had once told myself I didn't care where the pictures went. But that morning, I did. In the kitchen, the coffee machine was already sputtering. Melissa was at the counter in her robe, stirring something green into her glass. "Spinach and spirulina?" she offered, without looking at me. Good for inflammation. I poured myself a cup of black coffee and sat down. The silence between us was not hostile exactly. It was management. She moved around me like a hotel maid, efficient and distant. David entered next, still in sweatpants, with his hair tousled from sleep. "Morning," he said, glancing at me, then at the urn I had placed on the table again. He didn't comment, just reached for a banana and peeled it carefully. We ate in awkward rhythm, the scrape of a spoon against ceramic, the sip of coffee, the buzz of Melissa's phone as she scrolled through whatever emergency her Pilates group was facing. At one point, David said, We're thinking about a small getaway for Christmas, maybe Colorado. Just the 5 of us. And I understood. That was their way of saying I shouldn't ask to come. I nodded. Sounds nice. Melissa looked up. You should treat yourself too, Martha. Maybe a cruise? They have great ones for seniors. The smile she gave me was pinched. I remembered that expression. She'd worn it when she told me she'd prefer if we didn't use old family nicknames for the children. Ellie had called me Nana once. Now I was just Martha. It was cleaner that way, she said. Easier for the kids to keep track. Later that day, they left for an afternoon outing. Something involving soccer and a pop-up puppet show. I declined the invitation, claiming my knees needed rest. David hesitated at the door. You sure? I smiled and nodded, and then he was gone, a wave of cool autumn air slipping in behind him. The house was mine, briefly, and I wandered it like a museum, careful not to touch anything, reading the exhibits. The pantry was organized with military precision, clear bins labeled snacks, grains, extras. The refrigerator had no leftovers, only pre-cut vegetables and water bottles arranged like soldiers. Upstairs, the guest bathroom had one towel for me and a bar of soap in a dish labeled visitor. There was no place in that house that suggested permanence for anyone who didn't match its rhythm. I found myself in the study. Harold had once imagined having a room like that, a place for reading, for jazz, for the occasional nap in a big leather chair. David's office was the opposite. It was sleek and cold. A standing desk, 2 monitors, a shelf of business books with titles like Scale Up and Brand You. I sat in the chair anyway. It felt wrong under me, too firm, too square, like it had never been lived in. I looked at the certificates on the wall, the awards, the degrees, all the symbols of success, and I thought of Harold's workshop, how the walls had been covered in pegboard and old calendars and pencil sketches of half-finished ideas. I thought of how he used to carve birds out of driftwood, how he once made David a toy boat with his initials etched on the stern. That boat wasn't on any shelf now. Probably sold in a yard sale or left behind in some move. When they returned, I was back in the kitchen, peeling carrots. You didn't have to cook, Melissa said, her voice tight. We were going to order in tonight. I nodded. I just felt like making stew. David hovered, unsure, then kissed Melissa's temple and retreated upstairs. She lingered for a while, watching me. It's just that we have a routine, she said finally, and sometimes old traditions can feel heavy. I stirred the pot, letting the smell of onions and thyme fill the air. Harold used to say the best way to change a house was to fill it with food. She didn't answer, just turned and walked away. The stew simmered. I set 2 bowls, one for me, one for Harold. I sat at the table and ate slowly, deliberately. Every spoonful was a reminder that I still knew how to nourish, how to remember. I left Harold's bowl untouched but warm. Later, Melissa returned, saw the place setting and said nothing. But I noticed the way her mouth twitched, the way she cleared it before reaching for a napkin. She didn't eat the stew, claimed she wasn't hungry. That night, I could hear them talking. The baby monitor had been turned off, but their bedroom door was ajar. Their voices rose and fell, phrases I could just barely make out. She's just lonely. But it's too much. The kids don't understand. We can't keep doing this every holiday. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling again. The light fixture above me looked like a small white cage. I counted the slats. 13. I counted them again. I thought about how quiet their house was. Not peaceful, just muffled, sanitized. Like grief had been vacuum sealed and placed on a high shelf. The urn still sat by my bed. I reached over and rested my hand on it. That weekend, we were supposed to take a family walk to the Arboretum. Melissa announced it during breakfast, like a company memo. "Great colours this time of year," she said. "Ellie's been asking to collect leaves." I nodded and went to get my coat. But when it came time to leave, David approached me gently, the way one might approach a frightened animal. "Mum," he said, "we're just going to go as a nuclear unit today. Less hectic, you know, but we'll all have dinner together tonight." I stood there, coat in hand, understanding exactly what he meant. I was no longer part of the nucleus. I was the electron, spinning outside, vaguely connected, mostly decorative. I smiled and said, "Of course," and watched them walk to the car without me. I waved from the porch. Melissa didn't turn around. When they returned, Ellie handed me a leaf, red, brittle. "For you," she said. I thanked her. It was the only gift I received all weekend. I pressed it into the pages of the book I was pretending to read, and later that night, I slid it into the urn's flannel wrap. Harold would have appreciated it. He liked simple gestures. He used to say that love was a verb. It showed up in wood shavings on the garage floor, in hands that always knew when to fold laundry or pour coffee. Not in grand statements, not in avoidance. The final straw came on Sunday when Melissa knocked on the guest room door with a soft tap. She was holding a brochure. "We've been thinking," she said, "maybe it would be nice if next year you tried a retreat. There's this place in Vermont. Quiet, beautiful, very healing. They do grief workshops and offer senior yoga. We can even help cover part of the cost." I took the brochure. It was glossy and full of smiling, silver-haired women on rocking chairs. I nodded. "I'll think about it." She smiled, relieved. That was all she wanted. Agreement, compliance, a solution. I closed the door and sat down. I looked around the guest room, at the single towel, the folded blanket, the Wi-Fi password card, the drawer that would never be mine. I placed the brochure on the nightstand, next to Harold, and whispered, "They want me gone, darling, but I'm not ready to disappear." Then I opened the small leather notebook I kept in my purse, the one I used for grocery lists and old recipes, and wrote just 3 words across a blank page. "Next year, mine." The shift didn't happen all at once. It never does. There's no bell, no shattering epiphany, no dramatic cry of rebellion. It happens quietly, beneath the surface, like thawing ice. A slow realization, a subtle tilt in perception. That morning, I opened my suitcase, not to pack it, but to finally unpack it. The sweaters I had folded so neatly days before were still in their place, untouched, unslept in, as though my presence in that house had been more theoretical than real. I took them out one by one, smoothing them across the bed, each fold a kind of reckoning. I laid out my good blouse, the one with the mother-of-pearl buttons, and I wore it even though there was nowhere to go. I tied back my hair, lined my lips, looked into the mirror above the dresser and thought, if I am to be invisible here, let me at least look sharp while vanishing. I made breakfast that day. Not for them, not for show, but for myself. Toasted rye, soft scrambled eggs, real butter, not the vegetable spread Melissa kept touting as heart smart. I brewed coffee the old way, strong and dark, and I carried it out to the back patio where Harold used to sit. The sky was clear, the air crisp. A single squirrel darted across the railing, indifferent to my presence. I took a sip and felt, for the first time in days, something close to calm. Not joy, not peace, but a stillness, like the middle of a held breath. I looked across the yard at the maple tree Harold had planted with David when he was 10, and realized it had grown taller than the roof now. They'd nearly cut it down once. Melissa had complained about the leaves clogging the gutters, but Harold had stood firm. "You don't cut down a tree with roots like that," he'd said. I watched its branches move in the wind and thought, yes, exactly that. You don't cut down a life just because it's inconvenient. After breakfast, I found an old photograph in my wallet. It was faded, corners soft, taken the summer of '82. Harold and I, standing in front of our first car, arms around each other, sun in our eyes. I carried it with me always, not for sentiment, but for grounding. I placed it on the nightstand beside his urn and sat down to write. Not a letter, not a journal entry, but a list. Things I had done, things I could still do. It started small. Tie a scarf, iron a shirt, make a roast. Then it grew. File taxes, rewire a lamp, build a flower box. I wrote and wrote until the page was full and I could no longer pretend I was useless. They had wanted to reduce me to decoration, a fragile relic to be handled gently and placed where I wouldn't break. But the truth sat there on that page, bold and inked. I was still capable, maybe even more than capable. I had survived love, childbirth, war, loss, economic collapse, and now this strange surgical grief that comes not from death, but from erasure. In the afternoon, I took a walk. No destination. I simply put on my coat, wrapped my scarf tight, and walked through the neighborhood. The streets were lined with trees already half naked for winter, their leaves crunched underfoot. I passed other women, some with dogs, some with strollers, none who looked quite like me. A few offered nods, one smiled. I stopped at a bench near the duck pond, where Harold once taught Ellie to toss breadcrumbs. I sat and watched the water ripple in the wind, the ducks moving in lazy formation. I thought about my own formation. The years lined up behind me like tidy soldiers, each carrying their burden. I thought about all the times I had made myself small so others could feel big, about the times I had held my tongue so that family dinners could stay peaceful, about the compromises disguised as love, the silences offered up as gifts, and I knew, sitting there, that I couldn't do it again. Not next year. Not ever again. When I returned, Melissa was in the kitchen arranging hydrangeas in a tall glass vase. She looked up, surprised. "Out for a stroll?" I nodded. "You walked all that way alone?" Her voice was tinged with concern, but not the kind that cares, more the kind that calculates liability. "I've walked farther," I said. "In better shoes?" She smiled, uncertain whether I was joking. David appeared, carrying his laptop. "We're about to jump on a call," he said, gesturing vaguely at the dining room table where Harold once carved the turkey. I nodded, stepped aside. They moved around me, speaking in half sentences, as if I were furniture with ears. I returned to the guest room and pulled out my notebook again. At the top of a new page, I wrote, "My Thanksgiving." Then I began to plan. I wouldn't wait to be invited next year. I would host. Somewhere small, somewhere real. I would cook everything myself. Yes, even the turkey, though I'd need to refresh my timings. I would invite who I wanted, even if that meant no one at all. I would set Harold's place first, and I would serve his favourites, and I would eat in a house where silence wasn't mandatory and grief wasn't a stain to scrub clean. I would not ask their permission to remember. I would not make my sorrow palatable so they could chew their food without discomfort. My grief was mine, and it had teeth. That night, I stood by the window in my room and watched the branches sway in the wind. A street lamp buzzed faintly. Somewhere down the block, a wind chime caught a stray breeze and sang one soft, uncertain note. I placed my hand on the urn and whispered, "Next year, we do it our way." And in the space that followed, I felt something settle. Not quite peace, not yet, but the beginnings of a spine I'd forgotten I had. The first true crack came the following morning. Not in the walls, not in my voice, but in the illusion they had worked so hard to preserve. It was subtle at first, barely a shift, but I could feel it, a disturbance, something fraying at the edge of their perfect holiday narrative. I had left my coffee cup on the kitchen counter instead of rinsing it and sliding it quietly into the dishwasher. That was all. A small act. But Melissa noticed. I watched her eyes pause on it mid-sentence, her hand faltering as she reached for a cloth, her breath tightening just slightly before she said, "We're trying to keep the counters clean, Martha." My name again. Not Mom, not Mother. Just Martha. I nodded and made no excuse. I wasn't messy. I wasn't rude. I was simply present in a way that made it harder for them to pretend I wasn't. Presence, I was learning, was a form of resistance. Later that day, I caught a glimpse of myself in the hallway mirror, the one they kept above the console table that held exactly 2 candles and a bowl of dried lavender no one had ever lit or stirred. I stood there longer than I meant to, studying the lines in my face, the way one side of my mouth dipped lower than the other now, the tiny shadows under my eyes. I looked tired, yes, but also deliberate. I looked like a woman who had lived long enough to know when a place no longer welcomed her. That evening, David sat me down after the children had gone to bed. Melissa was in the other room, pretending not to listen. He started with that voice. Low, measured, false concern, wrapped in administrative phrasing. "Mum, we've been talking, and we think it might be helpful to start looking at some long-term options for the holidays. Something that gives you more comfort, more autonomy." I asked him what he meant. He blinked, then said, "There are services, programs, places with social activities, other people your age. Not that we don't love having you here, of course, it's just, sometimes change can be good." I waited a beat. "Are you suggesting I book myself into a retirement home so you can have Thanksgiving without interruption?" He flinched. "That's not what I said." I looked at him for a long moment and replied, "But that's what you meant." The next morning, a letter arrived. Melissa handed it to me casually, as if it were nothing. No return address, just my name written in careful, narrow handwriting I hadn't seen in years. I opened it in private, back in the guest room, the door firmly closed. It was from Ellie, not an email, not a text. A real letter. Pencil on lined paper, slightly smudged in the corners. She wrote, "Dear Grandma, I liked when you brought Grandpa. I think he would have liked the salad too. Mommy got upset, but I think it was nice. I like your pie better than the store kind. I'm glad you came. Love, Ellie." I read it twice, then folded it and slipped it between the pages of the old book I'd brought with me. That letter, more than any conversation, confirmed what I already knew. Not everyone believed I was a ghost. At least one child still saw me. That same afternoon, I retrieved the urn again from the nightstand and brought it downstairs. Not dramatically, not defiantly, simply directly. I placed it on the dining table, the same spot where Harold always sat, and I pulled out the chair next to it and began to set the table. Melissa noticed immediately. "Martha," she said, a forced smile plastered across her face. We agreed. "No," I said. "You suggested." I didn't agree. Her face tightened. "This is confusing for the children." I didn't raise my voice. "Children understand more than you think. What confuses them is adults who pretend love ends when someone dies." She stared at me, speechless. David entered then, sensing the tension. "What's going on?" Melissa turned to him. "Your mother is staging a séance at our dinner table." I looked at him squarely. "Your father's ashes, his chair, his table, that's all." David opened his mouth, then closed it again. Then finally, in a voice too quiet to be courageous, he said, "Mum, maybe it's time to move on?" I smiled, sharp and clear. "I have. That's why I'm staying." It escalated quickly after that. The tension was no longer beneath the surface. It became the air we breathed. Melissa stopped acknowledging me in the kitchen. David retreated behind his laptop. The children were ushered upstairs for longer hours, as though I might infect them with my age. I cooked for myself, took walks, made small, meticulous notes in my notebook. And then came the knock on the door. I wasn't expecting anyone. Melissa answered it and called for me in that clipped tone she reserved for packages and complaints. "Martha, there's someone here asking for you." At the door stood a man in a tailored suit, holding a leather briefcase. He introduced himself as Derek Sorensen, a legal advisor acting on behalf of my son and daughter-in-law. He used words like concern, mental fitness, guardianship, asset clarification. I didn't let him finish. I stepped past him, out onto the porch, and said, loud enough for the neighbors to hear, "Tell them if they want my money, they'll have to wait until I'm dead, and I intend to outlive their patience." Then I turned and walked inside, closing the door gently, but with finality. After that, the calls started. Not to me. I never turned my phone on, but to the landline in the kitchen. Messages, questions, family members I hadn't heard from in years. I let the machine collect them like leaves on a lawn I no longer raked. One night, I passed the hallway and overheard Melissa whispering into her phone, "I don't know what she's doing. She's just present, and I can't breathe." That's what she said, as if I were the oxygen leaching from her curated life. That same night, I packed my bag, not because I was defeated, but because I was done. I wrapped Harold's urn in the flannel shirt again, placed the photo from 1982 on top, zipped the suitcase, and left it by the door. Then I sat at the kitchen table with a blank piece of paper and wrote 3 sentences. "You invited me. I came. I won't come again." I left it on the counter beside the vase of wilting hydrangeas. The next morning, I left while the house was still asleep. The sun was barely up. The streets were wet with morning dew. I didn't call a cab. I walked, suitcase rolling behind me like a stubborn child, the urn tucked under my arm like a promise. I walked until the houses changed from manicured to real, until the sidewalks cracked and birds dared to sing. I found a bench outside a small park and sat down, breath heavy but steady. I called a cab from there. asked to be taken to the nearest decent motel, not because I wanted to disappear, but because I wanted to start. That afternoon, in a room with faded curtains and a bedspread that smelled faintly of detergent and tobacco, I placed Harold on the nightstand and looked around. It wasn't much, but it was mine. I took out my notebook and wrote a new list. At the top, in bold letters, My Life, version 2, and beneath it, the first item. Remember who I am, even when they forget. I didn't cry. Not that day. I'd cried too many quiet tears in that guest room already. Instead, I lay down, turned off the light, and slept like a woman who had finally stopped apologizing for surviving. The motel room became a kind of sanctuary, not because it was beautiful or warm or comforting. It was none of those things, but because it was mine. There were no scented diffusers on timers, no passive-aggressive reminders to rinse my plate, no hushed voices in hallways when I passed by. There was only the hum of the old mini-fridge, the uneven groan of the HVAC unit mounted below the window, and the dull, flickering light that hovered over the bed like a tired halo. I laid Harold's urn on the nightstand, placing the photo of us from 1982 beside it. And then I stood for a moment, just breathing. There was no one to tell me it was too much. No one to suggest I be less visible, less emotional, less real. For the first time in what felt like years, I filled the room without apology. That afternoon, I walked to the small market across the street and bought things I hadn't bought in decades: white bread, peanut butter, canned soup, instant coffee. There was something delightfully defiant about it. I wasn't planning a dinner party. I wasn't bringing a covered dish to someone else's table, hoping for polite approval. I was feeding myself, and that alone felt like a reclamation. Back in the room, I made a peanut butter sandwich, poured hot water over instant granules, and ate cross-legged on the bed, watching local news. It was perfect in its smallness, but the climax didn't come in a dramatic confrontation or a grand speech delivered in front of a shocked family audience. It came through steady action, deliberate and personal. That evening, I turned on my phone for the first time in days and ignored every missed call from David. I didn't listen to the voicemails. I didn't read the texts. Instead, I called Ellie's school. I asked to speak to the principal, introduced myself as her grandmother, and asked whether it would be possible to volunteer in their library once a week. She paused, likely noting my age, maybe thinking about insurance, but then said they had a reading program for early learners that needed adult helpers. I can read, I said, and she laughed and said, Then you're halfway qualified. I thanked her, hung up, and exhaled. I didn't need a place at David's table. I needed a place in the world. The next morning, I went to a small church thrift store I remembered from years ago and bought a set of mismatched plates, a second-hand kettle, and a floral tablecloth that reminded me of the one Harold used to spill gravy on every single Thanksgiving. I set them up in the motel kitchenette like it was my own house. One plate for me, one for him. I warmed the soup on the single burner stove, set out 2 spoons, and ate in silence. The air around me filled with the scent of something not quite home, but close enough. Then I took a photograph. Just the table, the 2 plates, the steam curling from the mugs. I texted it to Ellie. I didn't add any caption. I knew she'd understand. Then I called the small rental office down the block, the one with the furnished studios available, weekly rates sign in the window. I asked if they had anything quiet, something with a window, maybe on the 2nd floor. The woman on the phone said they had 1 unit coming available the following week. It's not fancy, she warned. I told her I wasn't looking for fancy. I was looking for space. She told me to come by on Monday. I thanked her and marked it in my notebook. That night, I wrote another list. This one was shorter, simpler, more resolved. Get the apartment. Buy new curtains. Send Ellie a proper thank you. Write to Carol, even though she never writes back. Cook Harold's beef stew again. Laugh. That last one I underlined twice. Then came the final stroke. I wrote a letter, not to David, not to Melissa, but to the lawyer who had come to the door with his briefcase and his polite threats. I kept it formal but firm. I listed all the accounts and holdings in my name. I stated clearly that nothing would be transferred, adjusted, or discussed without my written consent. I included a copy of my durable power of attorney, naming myself as sole executor. And then, at the bottom of the page, I wrote in block letters, "Do not contact me again on my family's behalf." Then I signed my full name, folded the letter, and mailed it myself at the post office 2 blocks away. The clerk didn't ask any questions. She slid the envelope across the counter and said, "It'll be there Monday." I nodded and walked back out into the sharp afternoon air, my coat pulled tight, my breath visible and sure. By the end of that week, I had secured the apartment. It wasn't much. A kitchenette, a bathroom the size of a closet, a bed that creaked when you sat on it. But the window faced east, and the morning light made the floor glow gold. I moved in with 2 suitcases, Harold's urn, and the floral tablecloth. I brought the thrift store plates, a small lamp, and a set of picture frames I found in a clearance bin. I placed one on the nightstand with the photo of us from 1982, and another beside the stove with the letter from Ellie. The third I left empty, a space to be filled for something new, for someone, someday, who might see me as I am, not as a burden or a symbol or an inconvenience, but as a woman who still lived. On Thanksgiving morning, I woke early, tied my apron and cooked, not for an audience, not for their approval, but for Harold and for me. I roasted a tiny chicken, too small to be called a turkey, but it was close enough. I made stuffing with apples and celery the way he liked, mashed potatoes with too much butter, and green beans sautéed in garlic. I opened a bottle of red wine, poured 2 glasses, and set the table with care. Then I sat down across from him. I didn't cry, I didn't toast, I just ate, slow and steady, each bite grounding me, each swallow a small declaration. I am here. I am not gone. I remember. And then, as the sun dipped low and the sky turned that peculiar November grey, there was a knock at my door. Soft, hesitant. I rose, wiped my hands, and opened it. There stood Ellie, bundled in a too large coat, holding a paper plate covered in foil. Behind her, no Melissa, no David, just Ellie. "Mom made sweet potatoes," she said, "but I brought the good kind from school lunch. They're gross, but you like gross stuff." I laughed, a sharp, sudden thing, and let her in. We ate leftovers together. She sat in Harold's chair, legs swinging, and told me a story about her teacher getting stung by a bee during recess. I listened, nodding, the room warm with the smell of real food and the sound of someone choosing to be there. That night, after she left, I stood by the window and looked out at the street below. A few cars, a flickering street lamp, a boy on a scooter weaving lazy figure eights in the road. I closed the curtain, turned off the lights, and said aloud into the dark, "We did it, Harold. We made it back to the table." Then I lay down, the quilt pulled up to my chin, and slept like someone who had done the hardest thing, chosen herself. The days that followed were not triumphant in any cinematic way. There were no glowing arcs, no apologies sent by courier, no family reunions beneath strings of soft golden lights. What there was instead was quiet. Not the suffocating quiet of that guest room in David's house, not the managed stillness of a life curated by other people's preferences, but an honest, lived quiet, filled with the faint hum of the radiator in my little apartment, the rustle of paper. When I turned a page, the clink of silverware on real ceramic plates, I began to build a rhythm. Mornings started with tea now, not coffee, poured into a chipped porcelain mug I found at the thrift store, the kind with a hairline crack that somehow makes the heat feel warmer. I would sit by the window with the sunlight slanting in, Harold's urn nearby, not as a shrine, but as a kind of witness. He had always been a man who noticed small things. The shape of clouds, the difference between birdsong at dawn and dusk. And now, in his silence, I tried to carry that noticing forward. Ellie came every Thursday. No fanfare, no schedule, just a gentle knock on the door and her small face pressed against the glass panel, always carrying something odd. Once a handful of orange leaves, once a drawing of a dragon that looked like a jelly bean, once a single ginger, snap in a paper napkin. I never asked who knew she was coming, whether Melissa approved, whether David even noticed. Some questions shrink the moment. I simply welcomed her in, made tea or cocoa, and let her talk. We didn't speak about the urn. We didn't speak about the holiday. But she always took the same chair, Harold's chair, and I never moved it. Some things don't need naming to be real. On Sundays, I volunteered at the library. The children were noisy and sticky-fingered and always forgot the endings to the books they begged me to reread. But they listened. When I said a character felt lonely or brave or scared, they nodded. They believed. They didn't find emotion inappropriate. They didn't flinch at memory. There was one boy, Daniel, who asked me every week why my voice sounded like a warm blanket, and I wanted to tell him it was because I had spent decades wrapping it around people who didn't always want to hear me. But I just smiled and said, because I mean it. Christmas came and went. I didn't receive an invitation. I didn't send a card. I made myself a small roast, read an old mystery novel from the library cart, and fell asleep with Harold's photo tucked beneath my pillow. I dreamed of snow falling on our first house, of the drafty window in the bedroom that he sealed with newspaper one winter when we couldn't afford repairs, of the way we laughed when the wind rattled the walls like a train. I woke warm and whole. Spring arrived slowly, buds pushing out of tired branches, squirrels bolder on the windowsill, children in the alleyway drawing crooked rainbows on the pavement. I bought myself a plant. It died. I bought another. It lived. I framed Ellie's dragon and hung it above the kitchen table. I sent Carol a letter. No response. But the act felt like enough. Sometimes healing is simply the decision to act as if you deserve the life you already have. I never did see David again. Not properly. There was one voicemail in March, his voice careful, too smooth, asking if I might consider joining them for a Sunday brunch in June. I didn't reply, not out of spite, not out of bitterness, but because I had learned that a brunch invitation is not the same as a seat at the table. It's just noise. And I had grown very fond of quiet. And so, this is how it ends, or how it continues. A woman in a small apartment with mismatched dishes, a thrift store lamp, a kettle that rattles when it boils, and a life that now fits. I am not healed in the way people like to imagine, that romantic gloss of closure, but I am present. I am not waiting for permission to remember. I do not require their comfort to feel my own. I do not need to be invited to belong to myself. If another woman is listening, someone older, someone shrinking herself to fit into younger people's holidays, someone nodding politely while her grief is erased with scented candles and polite correction, I say this: you do not have to sit at a table where your story is not welcome. You do not have to silence your sorrow to keep their linens clean. You may set a place, pour a cup, light a candle, and speak a name. You may take up space. And if they call it inappropriate, let them. Let them whisper. Let them recoil. Let them shrink in your presence, but never, ever shrink in theirs.